In this lesson, we're going to spend some time talking about the social distribution of crime and deviance by ethnicity. Now, specifically, the requirement from the specification is for you to understand the social distribution of crime and deviance by ethnicity, or by account of and by reference to the idea of ethnicity, including some recent patterns and trends and different explanations for these recent patterns and trends. So you should have a basic understanding of the sort of direction of travel in terms of statistics and some of the evidence relating to the distribution of crime and deviance by ethnicity, but more importantly, things to do with the sociological explanations for these distributions, including the idea of ethnicity and criminality, racism and the criminal justice system, and the issue of criminalization. All of that is going to be discussed in this lesson. Now, it should just be noted at the initial outset that in the UK, crime and deviance as distributed by ethnicity is a very interesting but also a multifaceted issue. And it is shaped by a variety of social, economic, and institutional factors. So things to do with ethnicity and criminality, racism, criminal justice system, as well as patterns of victimization, all contribute to the results that we get, the statistics that we have as it relates to the crime and deviance statistics in relation to ethnicity. So let's just begin by doing a brief and basic overview of some of the recent patterns and trends as it relates to ethnicity and crime in the United Kingdom. So ultimately, the social distribution of crime and deviance by ethnicity in the United Kingdom has been subjected to much research. Now, ultimately, official crime statistics consistently show that certain ethnic minority groups, specifically Black and Asian communities, are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. So what this means is that they are represented in a way that is not proportional to the percentage of the population they make up. So they make up a smaller amount of the overall population in the United Kingdom, but they make up a much larger representation within the criminal justice system. So, for example, according to the UK Ministry of Justice and also to Home Office statistics, young Black males are overrepresented in the criminal justice system as both suspects and offenders. So, for instance, figures show that Black people are more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be charged upon arrest, they're more likely to be convicted of crimes, specifically crimes that are either violent or drug-related offences. In addition to this, when we think about Asian communities, particularly Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, they are also overrepresented in certain crime categories. So things like drug offences and, very controversially, things like terrorism-related offences as well. Now, one of the phenomena that we see in relation to crime and the sort of distribution or the unequal distribution of crime rates in the UK confers to this idea of stop and search powers by police. So the police have a certain number of powers and authorities. These are enshrined onto them as the result of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984, that sometimes just described as PACE, as well as the codes of conduct that are sort of attached to PACE. And within PACE, there are stop and search powers. And the phenomenon of stop and search is a key indicator of racial disproportionality in the criminal justice system. So, for example, Black people are more likely to be stopped and searched by the police compared to white people. And according to Home Office data, this might be a statistic as high as 6 times more likely to be stopped than that of white people. And these figures may be even higher when we think about the distribution in urban environments, in the cities, for example, compared to more rural institutions. And so this has led to claims of both institutional racism within the police system, especially within some of the more substantive police organisations, such as the Metropolitan Police in London, and also the idea of racial profiling by police, essentially profiling suspects on the basis of the colour of their skin, the basis of their race, rather than any other feature, like, for example, their behaviour. In terms of sentencing, as well, we can see that ethnic minorities, again, especially Black and Asian people, are sometimes subjected to harsher sentences compared to white individuals who commit similar crimes. So studies do suggest that Black people are often given longer prison sentences than white people for comparable offences, and there are disparities also in relation to bail decisions within ethnic minority groups. And so one of the things that should be noted and should be important to realise is that the sociological idea of crime and deviance is a multifaceted issue. It concerns many different institutions. And the criminal justice system more broadly is also a multifaceted area of study. It involves thinking about the police. It involves thinking about specific roles and powers that the police have. It involves thinking about the courts, but it also involves thinking about things like bail decisions, sentencing, prison sentences. The roles of all of these different groups and all these different individuals means that finding and having a good statistical analysis of just the whole system is obviously very difficult. You have to think about it in relation to each of these individual things. But we can see that time and time again, there are definitely clear indicators that ethnicity is a key factor that shows that there is a disproportionality in relation to people showing up in the criminal justice system on the basis of their ethnicity compared to their percentage of makeup within the population as a whole. So there's something that happens here. There's a thing that is happening here. We also see that when we look at research into victimization, and we will look at research into victimization as its own lesson in the future, but just for now, victimization studies show that ethnic minorities are also not only overrepresented as offenders, but also as victims of crimes. So we see that this can be the case when we look at crimes that take place within a particular community, the community of a particular racial minority, but also in particular things like racial crimes, like racist hate crimes or property crimes. So, for example, ethnic minorities, especially Black and Asian communities, are disproportionately targeted by racial hate crimes, including that, but not limited to, assaults, verbal abuse, damage to property. And so Home Office reports, again, indicate that Black and Asian communities are more likely to also report incidents of racial harassment or violence than that of white people. We also think that there are definitely problems to be had within the criminal justice system and reporting within the criminal justice system because victims from ethnic minorities might also experience difficulties in reporting such crimes due to fear of discrimination or lack of trust in the criminal justice system, given the fact that there is an overrepresentation of offenders of a particular racial background in the criminal justice system. This lack of trust then means that when it comes to becoming a victim of such a crime of that kind of nature, that there is the lack of trust in that criminal justice system to do anything about it. And so this leads to underreporting, which makes it very hard to fully understand the extent of victimization within ethnic minority communities, although we do know that there are certain victimization studies and surveys that indicate that ethnic minorities are more vulnerable to crime and less likely to be protected by law enforcement. That gives you an indication of some of the statistics in relation to this particular topic. What are the ways in which we can explain this then? Well, as sociologists, how can we explain the patterns and trends of ethnic differences in crime and deviance? Well, they can be a various number of explanations for why this takes place, and they can be categorized into sociological explanations, economic explanations, cultural explanations, and institutional explanations. The first is this idea of ethnicity and criminality, suggesting that differences in criminal behavior can be attributed to the structural and social disadvantages that are experienced by certain ethnic groups. So essentially, we can just root the idea of criminality in the broader conversation about social and economic inequality. We know that poverty and inequality does increase the rate of crime. And so one of the things that we can then focus on is the fact that there are social and economic inequalities within society. And these social and economic inequalities can lead to a higher rate of crime and a disproportionate rate of crime in certain minority groups. So ethnic minorities, particularly Black, Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups, often experience higher levels of poverty and unemployment and social exclusion, which, according to this theory, can lead to a higher likelihood that they engage in criminal behavior. The idea of relative deprivation is where we see individuals or groups feeling deprived in comparison to others within society. And this idea of relative deprivation may contribute to a sense of frustration or alienation within society and a lack of opportunity that then leads to individuals committing these crimes. So when we see that there are fewer opportunities for education and for employment, or even just for social mobility, this can potentially lead to a likelihood of the involvement in crime as a coping mechanism. Another theory is that we can explain the distinction and disparity in crime rates due to cultural differences between the values of certain ethnic groups. And this is a theory which suggests that cultural values, norms, and practices within some communities can have an effect on the levels of criminal behavior. So cultural factors might include things like family structure or social cohesion or expectations surrounding male identity and ideas about masculinity that can influence the rates of violent crime and maybe even gang involvement. Now, there are critics of this particular explanation which suggest that using this can lead to stereotyping or even victim blaming, and instead ignore these structural inequalities that can contribute to these crimes. Because essentially, if we're suggesting that people are just born into a culture that commits greater crimes, that firstly does not make a difference to how we try and solve this problem or deal with trying to solve this problem or trying to improve this problem, but also it ignores structural inequalities that also contribute to crime. Structural inequalities such as institutional discrimination or institutional racism or systemic discrimination. This is a key factor in explaining disproportionate representation within the criminal justice system. So ethnic minorities often face discrimination from police, from the courts, and the broader criminal justice system. And this can potentially lead to a skewing of representation in crime and deviance. So we know already, and probably should know already, that there is extensive evidence suggesting that racial profiling and discrimination within police forces will contribute to over-policing of ethnic minority communities. And we know that this doesn't even necessarily have to require the existence of racist police, for example. It doesn't necessarily have to require that. If there is studies that show that that poverty and low education and lower employment in certain areas leads to higher crime rates, and if it can be shown that we can show that often people of a racial minority live more likely than not in those kinds of low income, potentially low employment communities, then it goes to show that essentially crime is more likely to arise out of those communities. And so if the police then start to distribute their limited resources to areas where they believe that most crime is being committed, then they're going to be policing these areas where there are racial minorities at a greater rate than there are in less racial minority communities. And so when we see that there is the higher likelihood and the higher arrest rates and overrepresentation, this can be explained by these kinds of institutional factors. The concept of institutional racism specifically was highlighted by the Macpherson report in 1999, which examined the police investigation into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was a black teenager. The report found that the police were considered to be institutionally racist, which led to the ineffective investigation of crime, and it led to the overrepresentation of racial minorities in police and crime statistics. Institutional racism can then lead to biased investigations, unfair trial outcomes, and altogether general discriminatory practices in relation to sentencing of ethnic minority offenders. Some sociologists also argue that the criminal justice system has a tendency to just criminalise ethnic minority communities, especially young black men, through things like police targeting, but also through broader sociological factors, such as media stereotyping. This is a process that not only increases the likelihood of ethnic minorities being arrested and convicted, but it may also create systems that are sometimes described as cycles of criminalization, where certain groups are perceived as criminal regardless of their actual behavior. Victimization theories also focus on how racial minorities and ethnic minorities experience higher levels of crime and violence compared to that of white individuals. So racist victimization and hate crimes are a significant part of this discussion. So thinking about ethnic minorities, Muslim populations and Asian populations are often targeted by racist hate crimes, which include both violent assaults and verbal abuse. These crimes are driven by racial prejudice and hostility, and therefore victims face discrimination when also reporting these to the police. In regards to things like social marginalization, ethnic minorities are at a higher rate than not, or at a higher rate than other racial groups, socially marginalized. They're more likely to be victims of property crime. They're more likely to be victims of violent crime. And this is not necessarily a situation where you're talking about violent crime, white on black violent crime, but it can still be a violent crime within a particular ethnic community. Disadvantaged communities are more likely to experience higher levels of victimizations due to things like poor housing conditions, lack of community cohesion, and limited access to social support. And then, as we've noted already, there is an issue of underreporting, which makes statistics of this kind more difficult to actually get hold of. Finally then, the media can play a significant role in shaping public perception about crime and ethnicity, about crime more generally, often leading to things that contribute to moral panics and racial stereotypes. The media often portrays ethnic minorities, particularly black men, as being more likely involved in violent crime and overemphasizing things like gang activity, despite the fact that we know that the majority of minorities are law-abiding citizens. And so the media portrayals contribute to a public perception that certain ethnic groups are more quote-unquote criminal. They're labeled as more criminal than others. Media and political narratives around crime also have the effect of racialization of certain crimes, associating certain crimes with certain ethnic groups. This is probably most prevalent and most prominent when you think about the association of things like terrorist offences with Asian communities. This is obviously something that happened and has happened in the recent 20 or so years, the last 20 or so years, but is an example of this racialization of crime. It then therefore reinforces societal fears and prejudices, as well as contributing to stereotypical criminalization of ethnic minorities.